After more than 3 decades together, one of reality television and fashion's most recognizable partnerships came to an end. Rachel Zoe and Rodger Berman had spent nearly their entire adult lives building something together. A relationship, a family, a business empire, and eventually a reality television legacy that introduced millions of viewers to the glamorous, chaotic, and sometimes brutally demanding world behind celebrity fashion. For years, they appeared to be the definition of a power couple. Rachel was the visionary, the stylist, the fashion force with the unmistakable voice and instantly recognizable personality. Rodger was often presented as the businessman, the manager, and the person helping transform Rachel Zoe from a celebrity stylist into a global lifestyle brand. Together, they survived decades of change. They went from young adults building a relationship to married partners building businesses. They welcomed 2 sons. They invited cameras into their lives on the Rachel Zoe Project. And for viewers who had watched their journey unfold, their relationship seemed almost inseparable from the Rachel Zoe brand itself. But in September 2024, that image changed forever. Rachel Zoe and Rodger Berman announced that after 33 years together and 26 years married, they had made the mutual decision to end their marriage. And suddenly, fans were left asking the question that always follows the collapse of a relationship that has lasted this long. Was there one explosive event? Was this a sudden decision? Did working together for decades slowly change their marriage? Did they simply become different people? Or was the truth something far more complicated than any single headline could explain? 'Cause what makes this story so fascinating is that the public announcement was only the beginning. Rachel Zoe later filed for divorce. She then stepped into one of the most personal chapters of her life in front of television cameras after joining the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. And during her return to Bravo, viewers began hearing more about the emotional complexity behind the end of a relationship that had lasted more than 3 decades. But there is an important distinction we need to make right from the beginning. This is not a story about inventing a scandal. It is not a story about creating fake affairs, secret betrayals, or imaginary courtroom drama. Rachel Zoe herself has spoken publicly about aspects of the breakdown of the relationship. Rodger Berman has also commented publicly on the separation. And the court filings and subsequent reporting established a clear timeline. The couple announced their separation in September 2024, Rachel filed for divorce in July 2025, and in February 2026 she said the divorce was still not officially finalized but was expected to be completed soon. So tonight we're going beyond the headline. We're looking at the entire story. How Rachel Zoe and Rodger Berman met. How they built their extraordinary partnership. Why their professional relationship may have become one of the most complicated parts of their personal relationship. What Rachel has publicly revealed about reaching a breaking point. What the divorce filings tell us. And how Rachel Zoe's arrival on the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills turned one of the most private transitions of her life into a public conversation. 'Cause sometimes the end of a marriage doesn't come with one dramatic explosion. Sometimes the real story is much quieter. 2 people grow. Their lives change. Their priorities shift. And eventually, after years of history, they discover that the relationship that carried them through one chapter of life may no longer be able to carry them through the next. This is the story of Rachel Zoe, Rodger Berman, and the end of a 33-year relationship. And the details are far more complicated than the headlines suggest. To understand why the separation of Rachel Zoe and Rodger Berman attracted so much attention, you first have to understand just how long their story had been unfolding. This wasn't a celebrity couple who met after becoming famous. This wasn't a Hollywood relationship created under the spotlight. Their history began long before the Rachel Zoe Project, long before the celebrity styling empire, and long before Rachel Zoe became a familiar name in fashion and reality television. Couple met while attending George Washington University in 1991, according to reporting on their relationship timeline. They married in 1998. By the time they announced their separation in September 2024, they had been together for 33 years and married for 26. Think about what 33 years actually means. 33 years means watching each other grow from young adulthood into middle age. It means surviving career changes, financial risks, personal reinventions, parenthood, and the enormous pressure that comes with becoming recognizable public figures. For most of their relationship, Rachel Zoe and Rodger Berman weren't simply husband and wife. They were partners in almost every sense of the word. And that distinction may be one of the keys to understanding why the end of their marriage became such a complicated transition. 'Cause a normal divorce can involve separating two lives. But what happens when the two lives have been intertwined personally, professionally, financially, and publicly for decades? What happens when the person you are separating from isn't only your spouse? What happens when that person has also been your manager, business partner, collaborator, and one of the central figures in the story of your career? That is where the Rachel Zoe and Rodger Berman story becomes different from a typical celebrity divorce. Personal and professional relationship were deeply connected. And for years, that connection appeared to be one of their greatest strengths. Until, according to Rachel's own later reflections, it became one of the areas she came to regret. But before we get there, we have to understand the empire they built. Rachel Zoe became one of the most influential celebrity stylists of her era. Her aesthetic became synonymous with a particular kind of Hollywood glamour: oversized sunglasses, vintage fashion, flowing silhouettes, luxury accessories, and a carefully curated mixture of old Hollywood and modern celebrity culture. But Rachel's success wasn't simply about clothing. She helped transform celebrity styling into entertainment. Before reality television gave viewers behind-the-scenes access to nearly every industry imaginable, fashion styling remained relatively mysterious to the average viewer. They saw the dresses. They saw the photographs. But they didn't always see the frantic process behind the scenes. Rachel Zoe helped change that. When the Rachel Zoe Project arrived on Bravo, viewers were invited into a world filled with fashion emergencies, celebrity clients, assistants, designers, deadlines, fittings, photo shoots, and the enormous pressure behind creating a public image. The show ran from 2008 to 2013 and helped establish Rachel Zoe as more than just a stylist. She became a television personality, a businesswoman, a recognizable celebrity in her own right. And Rodger Berman was part of that story. Viewers didn't simply see Rachel navigating the fashion industry. They also saw the relationship behind the brand. Rodger was part of the professional infrastructure surrounding Rachel's career, and the show helped establish the idea of the two as a team. That image became central to how many fans understood their marriage. Rachel and Rodger weren't simply married. They were building, always building, a career, company, a family, public identity. And that can be incredibly powerful. But it can also create a difficult question. When does the business end and the marriage begin? And what happens when the answer becomes increasingly unclear? For decades, Rachel Zoe and Rodger Berman had intertwined professional and personal lives. Their public separation statement itself acknowledged that reality. When they announced the end of their marriage in September 2024, they made clear that they intended to continue working together in businesses they shared. Their statement emphasized their children and their commitment to co-parenting while also acknowledging their continuing business relationship. That detail is significant. Many divorcing couples face the challenge of dividing property. Rachel and Rodger faced something potentially even more complicated: separating a marriage while maintaining professional connections. And years later, Rachel would publicly reflect on the difficulty of mixing those worlds. During her return to reality television, Rachel spoke about her experience of working with Rodger and expressed regret about the professional overlap. Her comments suggested that the boundaries between business and marriage had become difficult. And that is an important part of this story. Not because it proves some secret scandal, not because it gives us permission to invent details, but because Rachel herself publicly identified the dynamic of working together as an issue in the relationship. A marriage can survive enormous challenges. But when every major decision becomes both a business decision and a personal decision, the emotional pressure can become almost impossible to separate. Imagine having a disagreement with your spouse. Now imagine that disagreement also affects your company. Imagine trying to take a break from an argument only to discover that you still need to discuss employees, finances, strategy, contracts, or the future of the business. For many couples, work is a place to escape personal stress. For Rachel and Rodger, the professional and personal worlds were deeply connected. And according to Rachel's later public comments, those lines eventually became blurred in ways that were painful. That doesn't mean every business partnership between spouses is destined to fail. Doesn't mean working together caused the divorce by itself. But it does tell us something important about Rachel's experience. By the time she began discussing the separation publicly, she was no longer presenting the relationship as the effortless partnership viewers may have remembered from earlier years. She was describing transformation, change, and a recognition that the relationship had reached a point where the old structure no longer worked. On September 9, 2024, Rachel Zoe publicly announced that she and Rodger Berman had made the mutual decision to end their marriage. The statement was notable for what it said and for what it did not say. It did not accuse either person of wrongdoing. It did not reveal an explosive event. It did not announce a public war. Instead, the couple focused on their history, their family, and their future as co-parents and business partners. Key facts were unmistakable: 33 years together, 26 years married, and now a mutual decision to end the marriage. For fans, the number itself was stunning. 33 years. In the world of celebrity relationships, that kind of longevity carries enormous emotional weight. People begin to assume that a couple has survived everything. They have already made it through the difficult years. They have already proven the doubters wrong. They have already built a history strong enough to withstand the ordinary pressures that destroy other relationships. But longevity doesn't make a relationship immune to change. In fact, sometimes the longer a relationship lasts, the more complicated its ending becomes. 'Cause you're not just grieving the present. You're also confronting the memories. The early years. Careers you built. The children you raised. The homes. The holidays. Private jokes. Public milestones. Person you were when you first met. And the person you became decades later. That is what made Rachel and Rodger's announcement resonate with so many people. It wasn't simply another celebrity breakup. It was the end of a relationship that had lasted longer than many fans had been alive. And the announcement came during a period when Rachel Zoe herself was entering a completely new chapter. Rachel Zoe and Rodger Berman share two sons, Skylar and Caius. From the beginning of their public separation announcement, the couple made clear that their children were their priority. That statement matters because divorce stories involving celebrities often become dominated by accusations, rumors, and speculation. Rachel and Rodger initially presented a different public message. Their focus was on family. They said they were committed to co-parenting. And they emphasized the importance of continuing to support their children during the transition. Later reporting on Rachel's divorce filing indicated that she sought joint legal and physical custody and did not seek spousal support, according to coverage of the court documents. But the legal details are only part of the story. The emotional reality of co-parenting after a decades-long relationship is much more complicated than a court filing. A marriage can end. A family structure has to change. And children, regardless of their age, can experience that change in deeply personal ways. Rachel later discussed aspects of navigating this new chapter publicly. And one of the recurring themes was that the goal was to move forward while protecting the children from unnecessary conflict. That doesn't mean every moment was easy. In fact, Rachel's public comments made it clear that the transition was emotionally complicated. But there is a major difference between acknowledging difficulty and declaring war. And one of the most important things to understand about this story is that public information does not support turning every difficult moment into an invented scandal. There were real emotions. There were real disagreements. There were real reasons the marriage ended. But the story deserves to be told through what the people involved have actually said, not through fictional headlines. The separation announcement came in September 2024, but the legal process would follow later. In July 2025, Rachel Zoe filed for divorce from Rodger Berman, citing irreconcilable differences, according to reporting on the filing. The filing represented a significant shift. The 2024 announcement had made it clear that the couple was separating. 2025 filing formally moved the process into the legal system. According to coverage of the filing, Rachel requested joint legal and physical custody of their children and did not seek spousal support. And yet, even then, the story wasn't over. Because divorce filings can take time. Negotiations take time. Financial arrangements take time. Custody arrangements take time. And for Rachel Zoe, this legal transition was happening while she was preparing for, or already navigating, another enormous change in her public life. She was coming back to Bravo. But this time, it would not be the Rachel Zoe Project. This time, Rachel Zoe was entering the world of the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. And that decision would change the way millions of people experienced her personal story. Rachel Zoe was no stranger to Bravo. In fact, she had already built a major part of her television identity on the network. But returning to Bravo through the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills represented something entirely different. Her original reality series had focused heavily on her professional world. Fashion, celebrity styling, her employees, her business, her brand. But the Real Housewives operates differently. The franchise has always been built around the intersection of friendship, family, wealth, conflict, and personal transformation. And Rachel entered the show during one of the most transformative periods of her life. Her marriage was ending. Her family structure was changing. Her professional relationship with Rodger was evolving. And suddenly, Rachel was preparing to discuss parts of that experience in front of cameras. That takes us to one of the central questions surrounding her return to reality television. Why now? Rachel has publicly described this period as transformative, and her Bravo return gave her an opportunity to present a version of herself navigating a completely different stage of life. Reporting and interviews surrounding her return emphasized that she was entering a new personal and professional chapter. For viewers, that created something powerful. They had known Rachel Zoe as part of a couple. Now they were watching Rachel Zoe rediscover herself as an individual. And that transition became one of the most emotionally significant storylines surrounding her return to television. One of the most striking aspects of Rachel Zoe's public discussion of the marriage was her recognition that a long relationship can involve watching another person change. And watching yourself change. Rachel publicly reflected on the breakdown of the relationship and the ways in which the personal and professional dynamics had affected her. In comments reported around Rob, she spoke emotionally about her regret concerning working together and about the feeling that the person she had known through much of her adult life had become unfamiliar to her. That is an extraordinary statement, 'cause it captures something many people experience but struggle to explain. When you meet someone at 20, 21, or 22 years old, you don't yet know who either of you will become at 50. The person you marry can change. You can change. The circumstances surrounding you can change. And sometimes the hardest realization is not that someone suddenly became a stranger. It's that the change happened slowly enough that you didn't fully recognize it until you looked back. That appears to be part of the emotional landscape Rachel was describing. Not necessarily one explosive betrayal. Not necessarily one moment that destroyed everything. But a relationship that, over time, had become increasingly difficult to maintain in the form it once existed. And that brings us to one of the most misunderstood parts of celebrity divorce. Public always wants one reason. One villain. One event. One smoking gun. But life rarely works that way. Relationships can end because of 1,000 conversations, 1,000 frustrations, 1,000 small disappointments, and eventually the accumulation becomes impossible to ignore. Rachel later discussed the idea of a final straw, but she also made clear in public comments that the relationship had been strained for multiple reasons. And that distinction matters. 'Cause if you focus only on one headline, you may miss the larger story. By 2026, Rachel Zoe had become more open about the emotional circumstances surrounding the end of her marriage. In reporting about her Rob appearances, she discussed an incident that she described as deeply upsetting and framed it within a broader pattern of problems in the relationship. But again, context is essential. Rachel did not publicly reduce the entire end of a 33-year relationship to one isolated event. She indicated that there were multiple reasons the relationship had become strained. The final straw was part of a larger story. And that is the key point. A final straw only matters because something came before it. A marriage does not reach a breaking point because of one tiny event occurring in an otherwise perfect relationship. The phrase itself suggests accumulation, pressure, history, and eventually a moment when the person involved decides they can no longer continue in the same way. Rachel's comments about her relationship suggested that the breakdown had been building over time. For viewers, this created a more complicated picture than the original 2024 statement. The public announcement had been respectful. It had been focused on family. It had been mutual in tone. But later, Rachel began sharing the emotional reality behind why the relationship had reached its end. And those two things can exist at the same time. A separation can be legally and publicly respectful while still being emotionally painful. You can choose not to publicly attack someone while still believing that the relationship no longer works. You can prioritize your children while carrying disappointment. You can acknowledge decades of memories while deciding that the future has to look different. That is the complexity at the heart of Rachel Zoe's story. One of the dangers in telling a story about a divorce is turning one person into the narrator and the other person into a fictional villain. We have to be careful not to do that here. Rachel Zoe has spoken publicly about her own experience. That gives us insight into how she viewed the breakdown of the marriage. But her perspective is her perspective. Rodger Berman has also commented publicly about the separation, describing the relationship as amicable in remarks reported during Rachel's Bravo return. That means the public picture is more nuanced than a simple war between two enemies. And that is perhaps one of the strangest things about long-term separations. Two people can have completely different emotional experiences of the same marriage. One person may remember the relationship as a partnership that became too complicated. Another may believe the separation is amicable and that the relationship remains respectful. Neither public statement automatically cancels the other. Relationships are subjective. People experience the same years differently. And when a marriage lasts 26 years, there is enough history for both people to have their own version of what happened. What we should not do is invent motives that have not been confirmed. We should not declare a secret scandal without evidence. We should not create fake quotes. And we should not transform reporting about emotional strain into unsupported claims. The real story is already compelling enough. Two people who spent 33 years together reached the point where they decided they could no longer continue as husband and wife. And then they had to figure out what came next. One of the biggest issues surrounding the end of the marriage was the fact that Rachel and Rodger's lives were not only connected through family. They were also connected through business. Their original separation announcement explicitly said that they intended to continue working together within businesses they shared. That statement immediately raised an interesting question. How do you end a marriage while continuing to maintain a professional relationship? For Rachel, the professional overlap later became part of her public reflection on the relationship. She described working together as something she regretted because the boundaries between the business and the personal relationship had become blurred. And this is where the story becomes relevant to anyone watching, not just reality television fans. 'Cause millions of couples work together. They own businesses. They manage family companies. They create brands. They share investments. And sometimes the same qualities that make a couple successful professionally can create pressure privately. A business partnership requires constant communication. Marriage also requires constant communication. But the type of communication isn't always the same. At work, you're negotiating. At home, you're emotionally connected. When those roles become impossible to separate, every disagreement can start to feel bigger. Every business decision can become personal. Every personal disagreement can affect work. Rachel's public comments suggest that this overlap became a significant part of how she understood the breakdown of her marriage. And after the separation, her journey increasingly became about building an identity that existed independently from the relationship. The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills has always featured relationships under pressure. Divorces, separations, friendships collapsing, families changing, businesses rising and falling. But Rachel Zoe entered the franchise with a particularly unusual history. She was already a reality television veteran. She already knew what it meant to have cameras inside her life. She already knew what it meant for viewers to develop opinions about her marriage. And yet, this time was different. During the Rachel Zoe Project, Rodger was part of the world viewers knew. On Rob, Rachel's storyline was increasingly about what life looked like without the marriage functioning in the same way. That created an emotional contrast. The audience had history. They remembered the couple. They remembered the old show. They remembered the partnership. And now they were watching Rachel navigate the aftermath. That kind of long-term television history creates a unique connection between a reality star and the audience. The viewer doesn't just hear that someone is getting divorced. They feel as if they remember the beginning. And that's why the story generated so much conversation. It was the end of a relationship. But it was also the end of a familiar television narrative. In July 2025, Rachel Zoe formally filed for divorce. The filing came after the couple had already publicly announced their separation. Reporting on the court documents indicated that she cited irreconcilable differences and sought joint legal and physical custody of their sons. Reports also indicated that she was not seeking spousal support. For many fans, the filing transformed the story from celebrity couple announces separation into a formal legal reality. There is something psychologically different about a filing. A separation can feel temporary. A divorce filing suggests movement toward permanence. But even then, the legal process did not immediately conclude. And that is another important part of the story. Celebrity news often treats divorce like a single-day event. A headline appears, "Files for divorce," and the public assumes everything is finished. But the reality is often much more complicated. There are negotiations. There are legal documents. There are discussions about children and assets. And there is often an enormous emotional process happening outside the courtroom. By February 2026, Rachel Zoe publicly confirmed that the divorce had not yet been finalized, though she expected it to happen soon, and described the process as amicable in the context of doing what was best for their children. So as of that public update, the most accurate description was this: Rachel Zoe and Rodger Berman had separated. Rachel had filed for divorce. The legal divorce process was ongoing. And Rachel said she expected it to be finalized soon. Accuracy matters because the real story doesn't need exaggeration. Truth is already dramatic. Another subject that emerged in Rachel's public discussion of the divorce was the issue of a prenuptial agreement. On Rob, Rachel discussed aspects of the financial transition and publicly indicated that there was no prenup, while also expressing her position regarding spousal support. Again, this is where celebrity divorce coverage can become misleading. The absence of a prenup does not automatically mean a catastrophic legal battle. does not automatically mean millions of dollars are being fought over. And unless a specific settlement is publicly confirmed through reliable reporting or court documents, it would be irresponsible to invent numbers. What we can say is that Rachel publicly discussed the issue as part of the broader process of separating lives after decades together. And that makes sense. Through 26 years of marriage, there is almost no part of life that hasn't become interconnected. Question isn't simply, who gets what? It's also, how do you build separate lives after spending nearly your entire adulthood together? That may be the most difficult financial and emotional question in the entire story. One of the strongest themes surrounding Rachel's post-separation public identity has been independence. Rachel Zoe built an enormous career before her marriage ended. She had already become a recognizable name. She had already built businesses. She had already spent years as a public figure. But there is a difference between being professionally successful while married and redefining your identity after a decades-long partnership ends. The second experience forces a person to ask new questions. Who am I now? What decisions do I make alone? What does my future look like? What parts of my identity belong entirely to me? And what parts were connected to the partnership I had for decades? Rachel's return to Bravo coincided with exactly that kind of transformation. Interviews and reporting around her return repeatedly framed this period as a new chapter in which she was reassessing both her personal and professional life. For someone who had built a public image around collaboration, marriage, family, fashion, and business, this represented a significant shift. And perhaps that is why the story connected with viewers. The glamour is interesting. The celebrity is interesting. Fashion is interesting. But underneath all of that is a deeply familiar human experience. Starting over. People often romanticize reinvention. They talk about fresh starts, new chapters, freedom, independence, and all of those things can be real. But reinvention usually comes after something ends. And endings involve grief. You can be grateful for 33 years of memories and still mourn the future you once imagined. You can know that leaving is the right decision and still feel devastated. You can want independence and still miss familiarity. Rachel's public journey has reflected that complexity. She has not presented the end of the marriage as though the previous decades never mattered. Instead, the original separation statement specifically acknowledged the family they created and the memories they shared. That matters, 'cause the end of a marriage does not erase the marriage. The relationship still happened. The love still happened. The history still happened. Children still exist. The memories still belong to both people. And perhaps the most mature part of Rachel and Rodger's initial public announcement was the recognition that an ending does not require pretending the entire past was meaningless. A relationship can be over and still have been important. That is one of the hardest lessons of any long-term separation. As Rachel moved forward publicly, reporting in 2026 also focused on her new social and dating life. That development became another reminder that the end of a marriage, even after decades, does not mean the end of a person's emotional life. It means a new chapter. Reporting in early 2026 described Rachel as embracing dating and moving forward after the separation. For fans, this was another major change. For decades, Rachel Zoe and Rodger Berman had been part of a recognizable public partnership. Now, Rachel was navigating the possibility of